evening, America. This is Remember the Fallen from COVID-19 on KLRNradio.net, and I am Sergeant Dave Matthews at gmail.com in the Revitalizing Lives and Remember the Fallen studio in beautiful Seminole County, USA on the Winter Springs Oviedo line. You see, we have adjusted our fire format to cover this pandemic for the freedom of justice. I feel we all have this gut feeling that we can't believe what is revolving around us as Americans decide on who to believe. I only can hope that podcasts like these and others on KLRNradio.net will live up to our slogan, where liberty and reason still reign, as you make up your mind in this uncertainty. This is Sergeant Dave in the Remember the Fallen Revitalizing Lives studio. And just having a roller coaster week. My emotions, I think, with everyone out there, has just been all over the gamut. I fell for, I think, it was one of those deep fake videos where it actually showed a black African American 20-year-old or so, young, broke into a Detroit nursing home, and it showed him beating up on a white elderly woman nonstop. Had to be over 100 punches right to the face, and she was blooding, calling her all kinds of bad names, and I was just totally dumbfounded. I was like, inside, I've never felt that type of pain before. I was devastated, and I didn't know what to do. It says, this can't be true, this can't be real. And I think it was a deep fake. So deep fake is the new thing that our adversaries are doing now. I'm pretty sure that's what they are doing, is they get a video now, and there's a way to create it so it looks real, and they put it out there as propaganda post. And what happens is a lot of us, and I didn't fall into it. It's one of the times I didn't. We call it clickbait. You see something, you can't wait to click it and share it. Be the first one to get it out there. You're so excited to get it out there first, right? But we don't substantiate from the credible sources it came from, right? So I didn't really know. So that's why I did not put it on Facebook. So I held back, and I reached out to some other people, friends of mine, and asked them, had they seen it, if they heard it, and no one's heard it. So I think that is a deep fake video out there. So you got to be careful what you see out there. It's not all going to be true. So I want everyone to look at the credible source of these posts on Facebook, on social media, and see if it's real, and double check before you click it and share it. This could hurt America. These things are infuriating. It's an incendiary device out there, and that brings me up to our talking point. This is the talking points from the host, Sergeant Dave. Our foreign adversaries that are playing this out, and you know who they are: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They are capitalizing on our ability as a nation to triage what is currently taking place on our nation's streets. Now, there's a legitimate grievance on the legion of black Americans and allies like Black Lives Matter who are exercising their rights of assembly and free speech. We are all grieving on this heinous act of police brutality. The trouble is, and this is where the insidious online work of our adversaries plays in, now couple that with our domestic radicalized groups like Antifa or the white supremacy, right? That have been waiting in the wings, sleeper cells for a lack of better terms, eager to pounce, pour fuel in the small business shops, break the glass of the storefronts, allowing the young, low-income, most of unemployed, to have an open season on looting because they can't even identify them wearing the COVID-19 mask. Now the civil unrest becomes contagious. It's a frenzy. Now they're looting in daylight. They don't even care what happens because their friends are doing it. They want a piece of the action, right? So can you just imagine, now throw in the mix the psychological warfare that's out there. Then you have the ignorance, fear, and then hate. They're all prone to believe the first thing that we hear, no matter what it is, done to debunk or discredit, it's already too late. Our inner cities are burning to the ground. Right now, we live in an era of outrage. For many of us, social media feels so real. Like what happened to me the other day. It was so real. I was so outraged. And they won. They beat me. And I almost did the clickbait thing. So the expressions of outrage online have come to suffice for action in the face of injustice. And they even give this a name now. The process even has a name. It's called virtue signaling. And we use social media to polarize ourselves along the lines of hot-button topics. And we know what the topics are, you know. So we've created this huge divide. And the enemy, our adversaries, know to divide, they will conquer us. So just some of the dichotomies out there. I mean, the biggest one, of course, is Republican versus Democrat, anti-abortion versus pro-choice, pro-gun versus gun control, freedom of speech versus political correctness, pro-law enforcement versus anti-law enforcement, which you're seeing that being played out every night on the 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock news. And then you got don't take a knee versus take a knee, no collusion versus collusion, COVID-19 is a hoax versus COVID-19 is a serious threat, mask versus no mask, open up versus stay locked down, voter IDs versus mail-in voting, immigration reform versus open borders, and then the big one, pro-Trump versus anti-Trump. No wonder we can't rise above the smoke of the battlefield, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. All right, great. Now we have Doc Diego on the line, our co-host. Doc, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing all right, man. Thanks for having me.
Hey, you're welcome, sir, and I'm looking forward to this. This is a pretty important topic we're going to cover, so people in the audience should really sit up and prepare to listen, because this is important stuff. So I want to cover the first question with you, Diego. Since the election of President Trump, politics has seemingly become much more partisan. Now we are at a boiling point, right? With the civil unrest, we have become more divided than ever. Now it's become more cynical, insidious, treacherous, allowing a less ability to confront the real problems our nation face. So in your field, clinical psychologist, what is the lens that you look through to assess the situation that our nation is in right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of overlapping lenses that we use. So clinical psychology focuses on really treating the individual, and I work with some active duty folks. I work with veterans and a number of different veterans organizations. I also work with law enforcement. And the lens that we have to use is one that is seen to the eyes of the people that we're working with, and trying to understand the world from their unique perspective and what's going on. Particularly in working with law enforcement, they have a tough job. I mean, it's tough. They're trying to, keep the peace in places where there is community policing. There's little things that make a huge difference. Like, for example, having officers who actually live in the community. And so looking at the lens through their perspective. Now, you mentioned the partisanship and the division. We've been tracking that since the 80s, and that division has gotten bigger and bigger. So traditionally in American politics, we've had more people who are moderate in the middle on either end, and so that majority in the middle is able to come together with compromises that are focused on the best interest of the country. A couple of things that have happened. One of them is as consumerism has grown, we become customers, and politicians treat us as customers that they go after our votes. And so using fear-based messages and, for example, both parties making the other party the enemy of the public. I mean, this type of division actually makes it harder for folks to get things done. Just like some of the good cops that I know who work in environments where they might be advocating for more involvement and connection with the community, but the organization is actually taking more of a punitive approach. And so that kind of environment makes it harder for folks. It makes them harder to get things done and to do the job of keeping the peace, maintaining order in the community.
Yeah. So how is the community approach, which is community policing, after this incident, after the smoke clears? How do you feel these officers are going to go door to door in these neighborhoods? Now, we did that in Sanford, Florida. Okay, when Trayvon Martin was killed with pretty much police brutality as well, the security officer, and we went door to door. Our police officer went door to door, and that must have been a difficult time after that type of situation. And now it's going to be just tenfold. I mean, how did that police officer get ready for his day to go knock on these doors? And he never thought he'd have to be in this type of position. So what do you recommend for these officers to prepare themselves to go door to door after this smoke clears?
Well, see, and that's one of the fundamentals of community policing is many of these police officers are members of the community. They know folks in the community. They can intervene before situations get out of hand. Many of these officers spend time with members of the community, playing basketball with the kids. Their presence is there, so they're not such a frightening individual. And when you have, for example, officers who live outside of the community, or you bring them in from a different department, I mean, all they're really doing is looking for, whatever the objective of that is, whether it's stopping crime or so on and so forth. So creates this gap between this is people we know and how do we turn this around into more of a positive direction. There's tremendous value in community policing, and this is one of the things that we're going to be hearing more of. Given the things that we've seen, it makes it seem like things are worse than they actually are. What it's doing is it's bringing these situations to the forefront. And there's been folks for a long time from within law enforcement, academia, and mental health, who've been advocating for systemic changes. For example, after the Ferguson riots, there was a number of folks who met with a task force, under the previous administration, and they actually outlined a plan to deal with a lot of these same systemic issues that we're looking at right now. And since the Ferguson, a number of different jurisdictions have made substantial changes and reduced the number of incidents where people use excessive force, and so on and so forth. One of the other areas that is really important is the needs of the officers. It's training, and training is usually part of those changes. So you use non-lethal means, to use de-escalation, to rather than just rushing to the use of force, is to basically assess the situation. And all of this has to happen in just split seconds. Like I was saying before, it's like their job is hard. Many of these officers are also service veterans. They have these experiences from combat. They have served our country, and they continue to serve through law enforcement.
Which reminds me of Colonel Mann. Just a great guy. The webinar. Thank you so much for inviting me to that webinar last night. That was so informative, and we're starting a group right now, very similar to what his panel was created. Maybe you can spend some time, or we'll go to you, and you can be part of our panel as well. But it just hit on the forefront of a lot of what needs to be done, and it is to lead, is to get out there and lead. Like I'm going to be leading at the VFW. So I looked at that webinar, and I said, what can I do at the VFW, the platform I have there at the VFW? So I'm trying to wrap myself around what Colonel Mann was kind of suggesting in the panel of that webinar last night. So what I got out of that webinar is just lead no matter what. There and just try to lead. You don't have to be perfect about it. Just be a human and be out there and just get out there and do your best of trying to lead your circle of influence around the people that you know. And that's what I got out of that. So what did you get out of that last night, Diego?
It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to work with Scott. I work with him both with Rooftop Leadership, We do the veteran storytelling and travel with the play with the Last Out, an elegy for Green Beret. And one of the things that is characteristic of strong leaders is a strong leader is a servant leader. They're able to frame the situation in a way that brings out the mutual interests of all parties involved and then provides direction on how to work together. That's indicative of a strong leader. I mean, pretty much anything, Scott says, hey, let's do this, I'll fall in line because most of it's in line with the values that I hold, the need that I feel to serve our community, our service members, our veterans, our law enforcement. And that brings me back to another point that I wanted to go back to in regards to the needs of law enforcement. They need our support. They need our care. And they also need the equipment, and they need the tools. One of the things that the Army did, probably it's going on 15 years now, is they took a bunch of Green Berets and said, we need to start treating our special forces as top-performing athletes. And so they sent a number of them to school to learn sports psychology and learn, how do we make the shift to human performance? A number of those guys are my friends, and I've been trying to take some of that same stuff and bring it to law enforcement because you have a number of things that the body does, especially in those intense situations. It has a need to respond quickly, and it actually has a type of learning that it will learn to respond more quickly. And that's where stereotypes and assumptions and things that people make in regards to a threat, their quality of decision-making sacrifices accuracy for quickness. And so they're more likely to act, and if you think about it on a biological level, your chances of survival are greater if you act first. And there's many situations in which our law enforcement are trained to respond, and then there's other situations where there might be an over-response. So, I don't think all cops are bad. You've got bad apples everywhere you go. We've had to deal with that in the military, lots of other situations too, where the aim of the individual is not in the best interest of the group.
Yeah, there's been some split-second decisions that police have been making, and recently, it's sad, but a lot of police officers are shooting each other. There's some incidents out there, and it's just devastating when you see a cop shoot another cop. And so their nerves are up at the highest level you can imagine, and it's just sad to see that our police officers what we're putting them through. We're putting them through that, Every day they got to put that uniform, and then they have to come home to their family, and they have to change their whole outlook. They have to just change the whole persona. Now they're a dad. Now they're a husband, and now they're a community leader, and they have to almost like leave all that stuff in the trunk and come out, and then they start all over again. The next cycle of working, and they work long shifts too, 12-hour shifts. So.
Right.
I went ahead and sent a text to a friend of mine who's a Raleigh police officer who's out there in the front lines. And I said to him, I just want to let you know, we are praying for you. A lot of us are praying for you. Then I put in, love you, man. And then he texted me about 6 hours later, and he said to me, oh, my goodness, that meant so much to me, period. And so, that's what they need. We need to pray for them. If you know a police officer, send them a nice text like that. It will go a long way. It really will.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the biggest ways that we can support them is to get them access to some of the memory conditioning techniques that we have, like ART, accelerated resolution therapy, and RTM, the reconsolidation of traumatic memories, because the weight of what people go through in service of the community weighs on them, and the more that piles up, the more likely that somebody is going to over-respond to a situation. And what we need to be able to do is to help smooth out the response of the nervous system so that it ramps up and spools up for action in the manner in which that the officer's been trained, and they're able to execute that action, and then go home and being able to process and let those experiences go. I've worked with a number of police officers who didn't realize the impact of the experiences that they had gone through, and it's in service of the public, and I feel the public has a responsibility accountability to make sure that they have access to these tools and techniques that actually can help them perform better and be able to come home at night and be present with your family, not trying to shake off the intensity of the workday.
Yes. Well, in 2018, we lost 228 police officers to suicide. I did a show on that about a year ago, okay? And you got to look in the archives of that show. I was devastated when I saw that high number. You know, it's getting almost as close. I mean, not close as the military, the veterans, but that's almost like every 2 days. You know, a little less than every 2 days, a police officer is taking their own lives. You know, so that's showing you how much stress they're going through. You know, so I definitely highly believe that we need to hug your police officer. Thank you for your service. We say it to veterans. We need to say it to police officers now. You know, every time you see a police officer, thank you for your service. You know.
Yeah, and it's like, and one of the best ways to take care of our military, our veterans, our law enforcement, and our first responders is to support them and help them to get access to these resources, because there's a lot of suffering that goes on that folks, it's been acquired on the job, and one of the concerns too is just this perception of strength and perception of its weakness to ask for help. And that's why we have to kind of redefine the problem. It's not help. I mean, people will get coaching on all kinds of things, from health to fitness. You go and you get different types of martial arts training, different techniques. I mean, you know, in all these jobs, there's a training aspect, but we have not built in a training and memory aspect. How do we process and make sense of the events of the day? And again, it's something that weighs on people, and then the maladaptive ways in which we cope with it. I mean, you know, of course, through the military and through law enforcement, you know, drinking is part of that culture. I mean, I'm, you know, not a guy against drinking. I'm a whiskey guy, but it's, you know, it's like when it becomes a lifestyle and it becomes the only way to kind of quiet down the nervous system, you know, eventually it starts having a cost, and that performance cost and a personal cost.
Yeah, I believe so. And then there's HIPAA laws on when an officer comes to that point. You know, they'll say, hey, you need to go see the shrink. You need to go see the shrink. And that's a stigma. And so once it gets out to the force that, you know, possibly he had to go have a meeting with a psychiatrist on duty, it gets out to all the guys in the office, you know, that might be the breaking point where they take their own lives, because now everybody knows that, you know, he had to go see a shrink due to his inability to handle the stress of the job. So that could be one thing, too, as well. You know, it's a very tough job. Oh, my God. It is one tough job.
Yeah, think about the language that you just used there about his inability to handle the stress of the job.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the assumption, that you can either handle it or you can't, or then it eventually catches up to you. The idea is that those memories and that stress needs to be worked out on a regular basis. Think about it as like, you know, a knot in your muscle. You know, all of a sudden it's going to become the focus of that muscle, or the body is going to try to protect the movement by filling it in with calcium around there. You know, and then you've got these knots that need to be broken up. So smooth it out so that way the memory and performance actually happens a lot more smoothly. And so looking at it as help, you know, going to a massage therapist, I mean, that makes sense, right? You've got a knot in your muscle. And for a lot of these things, I mean, it's just a matter of focusing on the memory to bring it to a resolution, so that way you can kind of focus on the other stuff. It's a shame that it all falls under mental illness, and then it gets the stigma. I mean, part of what we need to do is to change that conversation and help folks access these resources.
Yes, Diego, can you mention your resource right now? Can you help out with our audience and give me your website for us, please?
My website is Balanced Living Psychology. I'm actually one of the ART researchers, trainers. So some of the things, the training I do, like I just finished this week training some folks at Memorial Hospital in Tampa. And Memorial Hospital provides inpatient services for active duty, for veterans, for first responders. And so I feel my efforts are going to go much further in providing this relief for folks who are not only serving the country but serving our community. And it's like the more we can change the conversation around how we need to equip our officers, it's going to make a difference. I mean, I know a number of officers. They're my friends. They're people that I trust. We talk about how hard the job is, and even how hard it is, bucking the system when you're trying to do the right thing to make changes. And now that we're all on that page and we see what's going on, I mean, if you just look at some of the differences in communities where they have peaceful protests without any issues, or with a minimum number of issues. I mean, and a huge part of that is the approach that law enforcement took.
I was impressed with the city of Orlando. There was hardly any rioting at all. I mean, there was none whatsoever. So I was really impressed with Buddy Dyer and Demings, the sheriff, who was a sheriff as well. And he's just done a great job. So I was really impressed that there wasn't any mayhem in the city of Orlando. And so I was actually proud to be a part of an area that wasn't taken over by rioters and looters. So they're doing a great job in this city. But you just got to worry about the other inner cities that are basically run by, the blue state, So you got to be careful with those inner cities.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard that argument before, too, and it's like you have to look at it department by department, who's in charge, what the philosophy is, and how it's being run. I mean, we have some examples like Cincinnati and stuff that were able to turn things around. But this brings us back to your intro and where we started at. Some of the violence that we're seeing is actually from outside groups. And some of the groups that people have been tracking, within the FBI and other agencies, is the white nationalists. And there's a number of different groups, and they're highly organized. They have resources. There was a domestic terror warning that came out from the FBI. It's been about 3 weeks now because they were seeing increased movement and wanted to give law enforcement a heads up that they, could potentially be seeing some violent stuff. And it seemed like these circumstances fit. So in some of these areas where there was a peaceful protest going on, like, for example, in Minnesota, then they actually had these other actors, who were disguised and covered up, coming in to actually start some of the violence. And, for example, the person who set fire to the Philadelphia courthouse, there's been a number of arrests. And folks politically are kind of trying to shift the blame to other groups, but some of these other groups are not highly organized. The groups that we're looking at right now who people have been arrested, if you start to think about like the Oklahoma City bombing and things that have happened, more people have died in the United States due to domestic terrorism than international terrorism. I mean, one phrasing that you don't hear anymore is Islamic extremists. We have to be really concerned about that because these groups, again, they're highly organized, and they're committed to not only harming law enforcement but to civil unrest because they want to further their agenda. So there's been evidence of them planting evidence to actually shift the blame to some of these other groups. Some of them are just loosely organized in groups of people who play Dungeons and Dragons. Some of them have done domestic terror acts. But the network for these other extreme groups, is pretty involved, and we have a history of taking them on. I mean, we go back to the early 1920s. It's like, we had Klan elected officials, serving in government, and there's been, a number of different acts and stuff. We really think that these extremists have gone away, but they haven't. They've just gone underground. They've come back. And there's folks who are invested in having a different America than the one that we have.
Yeah, and the most recent was David Duke, right? Remember? He was a Klansman. And he was like the most recent white supremacist Klansman out there. And
well, yeah. So he's part of what's called I believe, the third revival of the Klan, because the political branch of the Klan. So if you think about the Tea Party. Back, when they had, a lot of folks in it, the Klan was actually pushing to be like a third party in the United States. And then that came down because of a bunch of scandals, and then also laws that were written that actually treated them like organized crime.
Right.
So they've come back in a number of different ways. And it really speaks to some of our underlying assumptions about different groups of people. So some of the ideas that they have in the extreme, portions of the public just have historically just kind of accepted those ideas. So, they look at their own behavior and say, look, I'm not as bad as these guys, so, it's not really a problem. But we have to look at the end result of what their logic and their thinking does. If, for example, a lot of it's based in what was called eugenics. And all you got to do is research eugenics to kind of look at what is the philosophical heritage that these groups have. For example, eugenics was pretty a popular American idea. It's shared with different folks throughout Europe that we can improve the human race through selective breeding, and that we can produce better people. And as a result, we used to sterilize people who were considered mentally deficient. We had many of these laws on the book that were all part of the eugenics structure. And when people talk about systemic racism, that's part of what they're talking about. And we've gradually taken it apart, but not taken apart the whole structure to create something that's more beneficial. For example, the last person who was sterilized under eugenics laws took place in Georgia in the 1970s. So you have a huge group of people that were never able to reproduce because the eugenics laws, targeted anyone who was unfit. What happened that showed us the extreme of it was Hitler. Hitler was quoted as saying that Americans are thorough with their eugenics, but Germans are more efficient at carrying it out. So there's this kind of underlying philosophy that still exists in these extremist groups. So it's not a matter of this kind of black and white. It's a matter of people's vision for America. Many of the people that are protesting with the police brutality and everything else that they're talking about, they want to be part of the America that we have right now. And these extremists, they want to reshape America, and they want to do it through civil disobedience, and they want to have another civil war. So we really have to be wary of that.
They want to tear down what us Americans work so hard for, and what our Gold Star families and our soldiers have given their lives for this country, for the Constitution. And it's so sad when you see people like that who want to just tear everything down that we work so hard to get at. Well, Diego, that's awesome insight what you have there. We're running out of time for the show, and I'm looking forward to next week's show. Who knows what's going to happen next week, right? We just don't know. This society, what's going on right now, it's a boiling point. It could go, the needle could move this way, the needle could move that way. We'll see what happens next week.
A couple words that I think might be helpful closing with.
Okay.
So even though our circumstance is uncertain, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we're just going to have to wait it out and see. But one thing we can be certain of is that we're American. And that America, we've gone through 2 world wars, we've gone through conflicts and pandemics. We've gone through all of this before, and each time we've come out a little bit better. So one thing that defines us as Americans is that we will come together for the right thing and for the right reason, and I believe we will. And I believe that this difficult time that we're going through is going to change us for the better.
America strong. I believe it. Thank you so much, Diego. You have a good day. See you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, bud.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, bye.
All right, it's getting 0:30 for the show. And before I relax, and go into rack ops mode, go to Sergeant Dave Matthews at gmail.com. That's SGT Dave Matthews, MATTHEWS at gmail.com. If you have any ideas or resources for our veterans, because veterans do like free stuff, okay? And you can like my Facebook page, Revitalizing Lives on KLRNradio.net. That's an order, by the way. Until all our troops come home from Afghanistan, share this podcast to all your patriot friends. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next week at 8 o'clock. Pop Smoke out.